Guys, Mr. TR here with your e-learning lesson for April the 8th. Today we're going to continue talking about diesel engines and we're going to get into some of the auxiliary systems to the diesel engine, uh, most importantly the air system. So we'll get through that and then once again you'll have some questions to answer for me at the end. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So the diesel engine is very, very reliant on air. That's why turbochargers are so widely used in diesel engines, is because those turbochargers force more air into the combustion chamber, which results in a higher power output. So the air system of a diesel engine is going to be very, very important when it comes to helping that engine perform to its highest potential. So some of the basic components of a diesel air system. Obviously, the engine has to gather that air from the outside. So we have a cleaner and an air filter that help to filter out those impurities before they enter the engine. What you have to understand is a diesel engine is a very precise, very highly engineered piece of equipment. And if a dust particle or other foreign piece of foreign material were to get into the actual combustion chamber, it could potentially prove to be very, very devastating to that engine. So we have to make sure we're filtering the air as it comes into the engine. So we have our pre-cleaner here. If when you see a tractor, you'll see usually you'll have an exhaust pipe, and then very close to that you'll have an air cleaner that looks real similar to this, that has almost a mesh to it. Okay, that's your pre-cleaner. That's the first line of defense, and then the air will go through an air filter. It will go through the compressor here. Okay, then on down into the intake manifold, and then from the intake manifold into the combustion chamber where the air is heated by that compression, um, and that's where our combustion takes place. Now, after each stroke, there will be exhaust gases that need to be expelled from the engine, and they're going to go out through the exhaust manifold and then typically through a muffler. Now, in this situation, we do have a turbocharger on this engine, okay, and basically the force of that exhaust going through the exhaust system is going to spin that turbine, which is then going to force more air in. So a turbocharger is a turbine blower that is driven by exhaust gases, which forces more air into the cylinder. Basically, the more air we can get in there, the more power we're going to be able to generate. So that's the purpose of a turbocharger. So how important is it to keep the air filters clean? Very, very, very important. Okay, so obviously, we know that a diesel fuel runs off of diesel fuel, but what we probably don't realize is just how much air a diesel engine consumes for every gallon of fuel that it consumes. So a diesel engine will use between 12,000 and 15,000 gallons of air for every gallon of fuel that it burns. So in terms of a comparison, air to fuel, it's really no comparison. Air is way, way more important than fuel. That's not to say fuel doesn't have a purpose, but we got to make sure we're getting enough air, because nothing will stymie our power faster than an air shortage. So keeping those filters clean is important, because if the filters aren't clean, it's choking the engine out and we're not getting enough air where we need it. Okay, let's skip up here. Let's start talking about the fuel system and the fuel system. So there are 5 basic parts of a diesel fuel system. You have your injector nozzles that inject the fuel directly into the cylinder in a fine spray. Those are very highly machined, highly precise pieces of equipment that determine exactly how much fuel is going into the combustion chamber. Now, keep in mind the difference between a diesel and a gas engine is that those injection nozzles or injector nozzles are only injecting fuel. There's no air mixed with that fuel yet. whereas a gasoline engine is going to use a carburetor or other fuel injection system and pre-mix that air a lot of times before it goes into the combustion chamber. We have our injection pump, okay, which pressurizes the fuel system. We've got fuel filters. Once again, we have to keep foreign material out of our fuel because the end of those injector nozzles is very, very small, and a piece of dirt or dust or something like that can easily block those injector nozzles and really screw things up in your fuel system. Your fuel pump, okay, is actually going to pump the fuel out of the fuel tank, okay, which is where your fuel is stored. So here's basically those 5 components all together. So here's your fuel tank. Your transfer pump or your fuel pump is going to pull the fuel out of the tank and actually send it through the filters. The fuel filters are going to filter out any impurities. After the fuel has been filtered, it's going to go through the injection pump. And the injection pump is what actually pumps the fuel through the injector nozzles. And keep in mind, we're talking about very, very high pressures, much higher pressures than a gasoline engine. Therefore, in a gasoline engine, a lot of these lines and fittings might be rubber or plastic. In a diesel engine, they're almost always going to be copper or some sort of steel, just because these engines run way too high pressures to, utilize just rubber or plastic fuel lines. So let's talk about how we get diesel fuel. Okay? Diesel fuel, just like gasoline, is a product of the distillation of crude oil. Okay? We pump crude oil out of the ground. It's a fossil fuel, and then we take that crude oil and we distill it into a number of things: gasoline, diesel fuel, kerosene, any motor oil, any number of things. So if we had 100 gallons of crude oil, how much would we get out of that 100 gallons? What would that 100 gallons of crude oil give us? It would give us 44 gallons of gasoline, 36 gallons of diesel fuel, 9 gallons of just miscellaneous other products. Some of those things are used to make plastics and rubbers and things like that. 6 gallons of kerosene, 3 gallons of lubricants. This would be your motor oil, fluids that lubricate, and then you'd lose about 3 gallons. So the vast, the lion's share of that 100 gallons goes into gasoline and diesel fuel. And you'll notice, if you pay any attention, if you look at prices for these things, they happen to be pretty low at the moment, but diesel fuel is almost always going to be a higher price per gallon than gasoline. And the reason why is because out of every 100 gallons of crude oil that we pump out of the ground, okay, we get more gasoline than diesel fuel. So, if you go to the gas station, you're going to see different types of gasoline, right? You're going to have the unleaded, the premium and the plus. They're different octanes. Well, we have different types of diesel fuel as well. And there's 3 primary grades of diesel fuel. There is number 1 diesel fuel, recommended for cold weather, remains fluid for easier starting, and we use it for buses, cars, trucks, and farm tractors. So one drawback to diesel engines is that they don't like the cold. They naturally don't like cold weather because heat is such an important resource for a diesel engine to work properly. Another reason why diesel engines don't love the cold weather is because their fuel, just based on its chemical composition, when it gets cold, likes to thicken. Okay, it thickens, and if it gets cold enough, it can actually thicken to a point where it won't flow through the fuel system anymore, and it'll starve that engine out. So we've got to make sure that we're using a diesel fuel that stays fluid for easier startup. There are fuel additives that you can put. You can put in your fuel tank for the winter months that help with that as well. But something you've got to consider. Number 2 diesel fuel is for heavy workloads, buses, trucks, and farm equipment mostly. And number 4, diesel fuel, ocean-going vessels with low, medium-speed engines. If we're talking about a barge, that engine's not going to run at a terribly high RPM. It's going to go kind of slow and steady. That's what number 4 diesel fuel is for. So um, those are your 3 primary types of diesel fuel. A lot of times farms will have their own diesel tanks on them, and they will have diesel fuel that is dyed red in color. And there is a tax exemption that farms can utilize basically non-taxed diesel fuel. It's compositionally real similar to the other diesel fuels out there, but it's not taxed. And the law says that you can run that non-taxed diesel fuel, the red diesel fuel, in just farm equipment. You're not permitted to put it in your car or your truck that drives up and down the road. So every now and then they'll try to enforce that. I can think of a couple years ago, we were down at the National Farm Machinery Show in Louisville, and there was a kind of a police checkpoint there, and they were dipping fuel tanks in diesel pickups as farmers came to the show, just because that was a high concentrated area for farmers, and they wanted to make sure that nobody was putting that red diesel fuel in their truck, that it was just for their tractor. Okay, let's talk about cooling. Okay, the 2 primary types of cooling systems for diesel engines: liquid cooled and air cooled. Okay, liquid cooled and air cooled. So a liquid uh, cooled engine utilizes a radiator, and virtually all cars, trucks, tractors are going to utilize a liquid cooling system. Those engines are just too big. They don't get enough access to the outside air to really get by with just air cooled. Okay, so we use a liquid cooling system that utilizes a radiator, usually in front of the engine, at the front of the vehicle. There's a fan behind that radiator. And what happens is that radiator is a hollow, almost tank, okay, that has air fins in it, cooling fins, and we fill that tank up with some sort of a coolant, usually an antifreeze. You can use water, but antifreeze is better because it doesn't freeze in the wintertime. And what happens is we've got a water pump that pumps that coolant through the radiator, okay, into the engine in a channel that runs past the cylinders, okay, and then back up into the radiator again. And what happens is, as that liquid rushes past those cylinders, it takes heat with it. It carries heat away and then takes that heat and takes it out to the radiator, where this fan, okay, basically helps to dissipate it. So that's how a liquid cooling system works. It pumps coolant through the engine basically to make sure that it's carrying heat away from that engine block. And then an air-cooled engine, you see this a lot more with like a small engine. A 5-horse Briggs and Stratton engine on a lawnmower isn't going to have a radiator on it. It's going to be air-cooled because it's small enough, it generates a low enough temperature and a low enough amount of heat, and it has enough access to the outside air that just air coming into contact with it is enough to keep that temperature down to a reasonable level. Okay, let's stop right there. Keep in mind you do have questions to answer to complete your e-learning assignment today. If you have any questions, feel free, as always, to reach out to me via email, or I can talk to you via uh, Zoom chat. If it's something that you're struggling with that can't be addressed via email, I'd be happy to talk to you over that as well. So your next assignment will be Friday. This assignment will be due Thursday by 11:59 p.m. Have a great day, and let me know if I can help you in any way. Thanks. Bye.